In our last lesson, we focused primarily on what can be known about God through general revelation, such as logic and the natural world. Through these sources, we were able to come to a basic understanding of God, but we reached a point where we could go no further. Basically, we can make some general statements about his existence, but we have no idea of what he is like. To understand God's character, we must study how he has revealed himself in Scripture. In today's lesson, we will do just that, focusing on various attributes of God that are demonstrated in the Bible. As we study the attributes of God, we are going to divide them into two categories: the communicable attributes and the incommunicable attributes. This is simply a helpful way of helping us organize what Scripture teaches. The communicable attributes are those which are seen not only in God himself, but also in his creatures. For example, God is a loving God. Love is something that human beings can also do. On the other hand, omniscience is an attribute that is incommunicable. God is the only being with absolute knowledge. We should observe that this is only one of several ways of organizing the attributes. Depending on which textbook you read, you might encounter many different ways of organizing these same basic truths. Some theologians prefer to distinguish between God's moral attributes, or those that are associated with morality, and his amoral attributes, or non-moral ones, those that are morally neutral. Transitive and intransitive is another set of categories indicating those attributes that are done to someone, you love someone, and those that are not, you don't omniscience someone. Along similar lines, we could distinguish between the absolute attributes, those that are all or nothing, so to speak, and the relative attributes, those that could be displayed in varying degrees. We can be varying degrees of good, but omniscience is all or nothing. In our discussion, we are only going to highlight what we consider some of the most important attributes. We could study the Bible forever and keep coming up with descriptions of God. If you compare different theology textbooks, you'll find that every theologian has a slightly different list of attributes that they choose to emphasize. Our understanding of God is very much based on our culture, and things that we emphasize or consider important today might not be considered as important in another time or place. As we begin this study, it's important to emphasize the attributes must be studied in balance. God does not have a dominant attribute that is more important than the others. In our study, it is a natural tendency to emphasize some attributes over others. We all might have a different favorite attribute that shapes how we view God. But technically, God possesses all the attributes in equal measure. Imbalance often leads to theological error. For example, if we emphasize God's love at the expense of the others, then we tend to ignore how he deals with sin. Overemphasis of love leads some to reject the idea of hell. With these points in mind, let's begin considering some of God's most important attributes. In this lesson, we're going to first consider some general incommunicable attributes, and then some communicable ones. At the end of the lesson, we'll spend some time specifically focusing on two specific attributes that deserve special attention in today's day and age. We will begin with the attribute of infinity. Infinity means lacking limitation. You are probably familiar with the concept of mathematical infinity. Numbers keep going. There is no lowest number or highest number in the world. The same is true of God. God has no limits. This has two applications. First, since God has no limits, it means that he is eternal. He is limitless in time. He does not experience the passage of time like humans do. 2 Peter 3:8 teaches, with God, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Second, God is limitless in space. He is omnipresent. There is no front or back or top or bottom of God. There is nowhere we can go to escape him, as Psalm 139:7 teaches. Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? God is not limited to the physical realms of time or space because He is their creator. God existed before anything else did. Physics teaches us that time and space are interrelated. If there is no physical space, then there is no time either. Therefore, since God is the uncaused cause, He must be both eternal and omnipresent. The second incommunicable attribute we'll consider is that of omniscience. God knows everything. His knowledge is absolute and complete. For instance, Psalm 147 teaches that God even has names for all the stars in the universe. He counts the number of stars. He gives names to all of them. We as human beings can't even see all the stars that exist with a telescope. God's knowledge is not just limited to the present. God also knows the future, including not only what will happen, but also what could happen if we made a different choice. Psalm 139:4 says, "Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." A third incommunicable attribute is omnipotence. Omnipotence means that God can do anything. His power is unlimited. Of course, we should clarify that He can do anything consistent with His nature, character, and will. Psalm 115:3 states, "Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever He pleases." As we said before, God's power is limited to His own character. In other words, there are some things that God cannot do for specific reasons. First, there are natural limitations. God can't contradict Himself or do something illogical. For example, He cannot make a square circle because it would be illogical. He cannot sin because it would contradict His character. Second, there are some self-imposed limitations. Just because God can do something does not mean that He always will do it. For example, God technically could have overridden human beings' free choice to keep them from sinning, but He allowed them to do so anyways because He gave them the choice. Another incommunicable attribute is God's self-existence. God is the only being in the universe that is completely self-sustaining. In Exodus 3:14, He described Himself saying, "I am who I am." As we suggested in the last lesson, His name Yahweh is probably related to this fact. He just is. God does not need anyone or anything. He existed perfectly in eternity before anything else came into being. God is also immutable, which means He is unchanging. God's character does not change. Since He is perfect, He cannot improve Himself or unimprove Himself. In Malachi 3:6, God refers to His immutability as the basis for keeping His promise to Israel. He says, "For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." Israel had rejected God, but God remained true to His promises nonetheless. A lesser God would have given up on His people long ago. When discussing immutability, it's important to emphasize what this attribute does not mean. Some have suggested that immutability means that God does not feel any emotion at all. This is not true. God is immutable, but He is not impassible. Scripture reveals God in many different emotional terms, such as love, grief, wrath. Nor does immutability mean immobility. God is not static or non-relational. God actively engages and interacts with people. Finally, immutability does not mean that God always acts the same. God always does the right thing, but He does not always do the same thing. Different circumstances require different courses of action. People change, and God will interact with them differently accordingly. But God Himself does not change. The last incommunicable attribute that we'll consider is that of unity. God is one. God cannot be divided into multiple parts or components. Moreover, there is no one else like Him. He is the only God. This is the basic assertion of one of the Israelites' most fundamental creeds, known as the Shema, found in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Yahweh is one. Naturally, you are probably wondering at this point how the Trinity fits into this picture. We'll give some special consideration to the Trinity in a little bit. But first, we're going to move on and consider some of God's communicable attributes.